I am observing the emergence of what may become the most consequential geopolitical theater of the 21st century, and yet it unfolds in a realm where most of humanity has never set foot, the rapidly transforming Arctic Circle. As I analyze the intelligence patterns, military posturing, and economic positioning now crystallizing across this frozen frontier, I recognize that we are witnessing the opening moves of a resource war that will fundamentally reshape global power dynamics, and the world is largely oblivious to the magnitude of what is unfolding beneath the ice. The Arctic is no longer the static, inaccessible wasteland that has defined our geopolitical calculations for generations. Climate data indicates that what once required icebreakers and extreme logistical support is becoming increasingly navigable, and with this transformation comes the unlocking of resources so vast that they represent approximately 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas reserves and 13% of its oil deposits. But these figures, staggering as they appear, only scratch the surface of what I am tracking. Rare earth element deposits that could determine technological supremacy for decades, shipping routes that could reduce global trade transit times by 40%, and strategic positions that would grant unprecedented control over both Atlantic and Pacific maritime approaches. I have been analyzing the systematic military buildups that coincide suspiciously with these climatic changes, and what emerges is a pattern of coordinated positioning that suggests each major power has concluded that Arctic dominance represents an existential strategic imperative. Russia has been the most explicit in its approach, deploying nuclear-powered icebreakers at an accelerated pace, establishing permanent military bases on previously uninhabitable islands, and conducting submarine exercises beneath the polar ice cap with increasing frequency and sophistication. Their Northern Fleet headquarters in Murmansk has become what intelligence analysts describe as the most heavily militarized Arctic installation in human history, complete with hypersonic missile systems specifically designed for polar deployment. The United States response has been more subtle but equally systematic, with the Navy's submarine force conducting what they term ice exercise operations that involve multiple nuclear submarines operating simultaneously in Arctic waters, a capability demonstration that serves as both training and deterrence. The Pentagon's Arctic strategy document, while publicly focused on environmental monitoring and search and rescue capabilities, reveals upon closer examination a comprehensive framework for projecting power across the polar region, including the establishment of forward operating bases and the development of cold weather military technologies that suggest long-term operational planning. What particularly concerns me in this analysis is China's emergence as an Arctic player, despite having no Arctic coastline, a development that fundamentally alters the strategic calculus. Beijing has declared itself a near-Arctic state, a designation that exists nowhere in international law, but reflects a strategic ambition that cannot be ignored. Chinese investment in Arctic infrastructure has been massive and methodical, financing icebreaker construction, establishing research stations, and most significantly, positioning the Arctic as a critical component of their Belt and Road initiative through what they term the Polar Silk Road. The economic dimensions of this competition extend far beyond resource extraction and represent a complete reordering of global trade architecture. The Northern Sea route, which runs along Russia's Arctic coast, could reduce shipping time between Europe and Asia by up to 15 days compared to traditional routes through the Suez Canal. For a global economy where supply chain efficiency determines competitive advantage, control over Arctic shipping lanes represents the ability to dictate terms of international commerce. I am observing shipping companies already adjusting their long-term logistics planning based on Arctic accessibility projections, and insurance markets are beginning to price in the economic implications of year-round polar navigation. But the resource competition itself reveals the most dangerous escalation potential I have identified in this analysis. Norway has quietly become one of the world's largest suppliers of rare earth elements through Arctic mining operations, while Greenland, technically part of Denmark but with increasing autonomy, sits atop mineral deposits that could determine whether the West maintains technological competitiveness against Chinese rare earth dominance. The geopolitical implications become clear when we consider that Denmark has been strengthening its military presence in Greenland, precisely as Chinese investment interest has intensified, creating a confrontation dynamic that involves NATO obligations and alliance structures. The intelligence community has been tracking what they term gray zone activities in the Arctic, operations that fall below the threshold of open conflict but clearly serve strategic positioning purposes. Russian submarines have been detected near undersea communication cables that carry significant portions of global internet traffic, while Chinese research vessels conduct operations that appear to combine scientific investigation with military intelligence gathering. The Arctic Ocean's shallow continental shelf makes it ideal for both seabed mining and the placement of underwater surveillance networks, creating a scenario where commercial activities and military positioning become indistinguishable. I am particularly troubled by the legal framework governing Arctic sovereignty, which remains dangerously ambiguous precisely when clarity is most needed. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provides some structure for territorial claims, but Arctic nations are filing overlapping claims for extended continental shelf rights that, if approved, would create competing sovereignty assertions over the same geographic areas. Russia claims that the Lomonosov Ridge extends their continental shelf to include the North Pole itself, while Canada and Denmark assert their own geographical connections to the same underwater formations. These are not merely academic disputes. They represent competing claims to trillions of dollars in resources and strategic positioning that could determine naval supremacy in both oceans. The security architecture that has maintained relative Arctic stability is proving inadequate for this new reality. The Arctic Council, designed for environmental cooperation and indigenous rights protection, lacks enforcement mechanisms for territorial disputes or military activities. NATO's collective defense commitments become complex when applied to Arctic territories where sovereignty itself is contested and where the scale of geography makes traditional defense concepts nearly meaningless. A crisis in the Arctic could easily escalate beyond regional containment capabilities. Climate change serves not merely as the backdrop for these developments, but as an accelerating factor that compresses decision-making timelines and increases the stakes of early positioning. Each year of continued warming expands accessible territory and navigation windows, meaning that current strategic advantages compound over time, while late movers face increasingly difficult entry barriers. The nations that establish effective Arctic presence now will benefit from cumulative advantages that become harder to challenge with each passing season of ice retreat. I am observing intelligence indicators that suggest all major powers recognize we are approaching decision points that will determine Arctic influence for generations. Military exercises are increasing in frequency and complexity, diplomatic communications reveal hardening positions on territorial claims, and economic investments are shifting toward long-term Arctic infrastructure despite significant upfront costs. The convergence of these factors indicates that we are no longer in a preparation phase, but in the early stages of active competition for Arctic dominance. The implications extend beyond Arctic boundaries and into global power equilibrium. Control over Arctic resources could determine energy independence for major economies, while dominance over Arctic shipping routes provides leverage over international commerce that rivals control over traditional maritime choke points. The nation or coalition that achieves Arctic supremacy gains strategic options that could fundamentally alter their global negotiating position across all other geopolitical theaters. What makes this competition particularly dangerous is its intersection with existing global tensions and alliance structures. Arctic competition occurs simultaneously with broader U.S.-China strategic rivalry, NATO-Russia confrontation, and climate-driven resource scarcity. A miscalculation in the Arctic could trigger escalations that spread far beyond polar boundaries, while the success of any single power in consolidating Arctic control could destabilize the entire global balance that has prevented major power conflict since World War II. As I conclude this analysis, I recognize that we are witnessing the opening of humanity's last great territorial frontier at precisely the moment when global power competition has reached its most dangerous levels since the Cold War. The Arctic represents more than a new theater of competition. It represents a test of whether the international system can manage resource competition and territorial disputes without descending into the kind of great power conflict that civilization can no longer afford. The decisions made in Arctic waters over the next decade will determine not just regional influence, but whether humanity's expansion into Earth's final frontier becomes a model for cooperation or a catalyst for the conflicts that define the remainder of this century.